We are not so far removed that Christmas doesn't also come to Baratown. What better way than to honour the season than by giving? And so this video I give to you. A small chapel on the outskirts of Baratown. And I hope the villagers are okay with the gift of a small chapel and monastic garden. I think that will round off the farming settlement just nicely. And just in time too, because it is feast season, is it not? In fact, Bara Manor will be feasting well this year. I sincerely hope you all will be too. So, as this is the Christmas special, I'm going to do two things. We're going to build this chapel and gardens, and I'm going to tell you a story. I hope you enjoy it. Thick mists rolled through Bara that morning. A foggy shroud seemed to muffle birdsong and obscure the faint shadows of low thatched buildings. Chill hung in the air, not biting, but nipping at bare fingers and exposed necks. Inside the butcher shop, Claude stood by the counter, hands resting heavily on the edge of the butcher block. The shop was quiet, cold, and the air carried a faint metallic tang of blood and steel. A single lantern flickered by the window, its flame casting shadows that danced along the walls. Claude's eyes were distant, unfocused as he stared at the grain of the butcher's block. His thoughts wandered back to the sheep farmer he'd spoken to with earlier that week, an older man with weathered hands and a crooked nose. "They're worth too much alive, Claude," the farmer said, shaking his head. "For wool, breeding, not meat." Claude had nodded at the time, but now the words irritated him, gnawed at the edge of his mind. Too valuable for meat. What wasn't too valuable these days? It seemed like everything had grown more precious, more scarce. And here he was, trying to scrape by with a shop that always felt one bad month away from ruin. His jaw tightened as he stood there, staring at the empty space on the block where a fresh carcass should have been. In a frustrated moment, he pronged his knife down into the butcher block. The blade buried itself deep into the wood with a satisfying thud, standing upright. Exhaling sharply, he yanked the blood-streaked apron from around his neck, tossing it onto the counter. He didn't need it. The image of his brother's face floated into his mind, a blurry vision of drunken indifference. The apron sank into a restless pile. The shop door shut behind him. Claude strode down the cobble street. The fog seemed to cling to him, parting reluctantly as he passed. It wasn't long before the faded sign of the prancing boar loomed through the mist, unmoving in the still air. The faint sound of coughs and low conversation greeted him as he stepped inside. The tavern was dimly lit and smelled of sweat. Near the back, hunched over a table littered with empty mugs, was Polo. His head rested on folded arms, his body slack with the unmistakable weight of sleep, or rather, a drunken stupor. Claude didn't hesitate. He stormed over, his presence enough to part a path through the room. Arriving over his brother, he planted his hands firmly on the table, causing it to shake. "Do you know what time of day it is?" Claude's voice was low, and he exhaled for a long time. Polo began to stir, lifting his head groggily and blinking at Claude with bleary eyes. He opened his mouth to speak, but Claude cut him off with a gesture. "No, don't get up." He tossed his head back and wiped his face with his hand. "I'll fetch Boar myself, shall I?" "You go back to the shop. Tend to it, do something useful. And for God's sake, have a wash." Polo mumbled something unintelligible and waved a hand as if to dismiss the tirade. Then, as if on cue, he collapsed back onto the table with a heavy sigh, his breath already slowing into a rhythmic cadence of sleep. Claude stared at him for a moment, his lips pressed into a tight line. There was no use in dragging this out. He turned on his heel and left the tavern, the door slowly falling shut behind him. The mist outside seemed colder now, sharper, and it bit at his face as he made his way to fetch the boar. Later that morning, the heavy oak door of the butcher's shop creaked open, and our bailiff steps in from the foggy street. For a brief moment, he could have been mistaken for a ghost. He was dressed in his usual, fine, albeit practical, attire, a thin cloak resting over his shoulders. The air inside the shop had the smell of a freshly started fire and the faint tang of cured meat. "Good morning," Thorn greeted. He scanned the empty hanging hooks and the bare counters until settling on Polo, who stood awkwardly behind the counter. Claude was nowhere to be seen. "Sir Philip?" Polo cleared his throat, straightening up, his face a mixture of nervousness and mild confusion. But Thorn wasted no time. "The manor requires a commission for Yuletide. A large amount, boar and venison, much of it from Lord Bara's own hunts." Polo hesitated, glancing around the shop as though searching for Claude to appear and save him, but the shop remained eerily silent. "That, Sir Philip, we've been busy lately and..." Thorn's gaze sharpened, silencing any further protest. As if he'd transfigured into an owl, his head swiveled over the counter and empty shelves again. "You don't look busy." There was a standoff. "Which one of you can read? I forget." "Me." Polo's energy drained as he took up the parchment, detailing the order and the rest of the instructions. The exchange was short, specific, and unyielding. And when it was concluded, Thorn turned and exited, the door swinging shut behind him and leaving Polo standing there, feeling as though the weight of the manor itself had just been dropped onto his shoulders. When Claude returned to the shop, his mood had not improved from the morning. He pushed open the door to find Polo's narrow shoulders over the butcher's block, sharpening a knife with uncharacteristic focus. The sight made him pause, his brow furrowing in suspicion. "What are you doing?" Claude asked, his voice cautious. Polo looked up, his expression strained. We've got an order, brother. For the manor. Boar and venison. For Yuletide. To be delivered every day for a week. Sir Philip was here. Claude stared at him, his face darkening as the words sank in. You agreed to that? Polo nodded reluctantly. What choice did I have? You're a fool, Claude spat, his voice rising. You can't even keep up with the regular work, and now you've taken on a commission from the manor. Do you have any idea what's going to happen when you mess this up? We'll be out on the street, that's what. Polo tried to see his reflection in the sharpening blade. I'll manage it. I just need to get started. Claude shook his head, exhaling sharply through his nose. You could start then by bringing one of those swine in off the cart. The butcher shop was unusually lively that morning, a rare and overwhelming flurry of activity for Polo. The air inside was thick with the scent of raw meat, the metallic tang mingling with the faint mustiness of the fog that crept in each time the door opened. Polo stood behind the counter, a half-carved pig in front of him. Polo, are you listening? Snapped Helesina, standing near the counter with her arms folded tightly over her chest. She was clearly out of patience. If you forget me again, I'll take my business elsewhere, mark my words. I know, Polo said, his voice a little too loud, a bead of sweat forming at his temple despite the cool morning air. He turned back to the pig, carefully carving into the flesh. Just behind Helesina, Marcule cleared his throat impatiently. The tailor's wiry frame seemed out of place in the meat-laden shop, his hands tucked into the pockets of his heavy coat. And mine, Polo, he said with a pointed look. I've been standing here too long already. I need to get back. I'll have it for you soon, Polo called back, but his movements only grew more erratic. The door jingled as another customer entered, a burly man in a hooded cloak with the gait of a farmer. Polo, the man barked. If I don't have my meat now, the missus will have my hide. Polo's head snapped up, his knife pausing mid-cut. I've got it. Just give me a moment. He dropped his knife onto the block and with a clatter and rushed to the back of the shop to check the storeroom. Helesina and Marcule exchanged a glance, their shared annoyance plain on each other's faces. As more villagers began filtering into the shop, the hum of impatient voices swelled. He's always like this, Helesina muttered, glancing at Marcule. Once more the door opened, and for a moment the shop fell silent. Claude stood in the doorway, his apron slung over his shoulder and a scowl already set on his face. He looked at the crowd, the unfinished boar on the block, the growing queue of customers, and Polo's muffled curses coming from the back. And with a sigh, he strode up to the counter. He picked up Polo's abandoned knife and called, "Who's first?" cutting through the moment like a cleaver through bone. Of course, Helesina stepped forward, her expression softening ever so slightly as she gestured to the wrapped bundle in her arms. If you can get this done quickly, Claude, I'll be out of your hair. He nodded curtly, grabbing the fresh cloth and wiping down the block. His hands moved with purpose as he finished the cuts Polo had left half done. By the time Polo returned from the storeroom, his arms laden with meat, the counter was clear. Claude was already moving on to Marcule's order. Polo froze, blinking at the sudden calm. "You're welcome," Claude muttered without looking up, his knife slicing through the skinned bone. Polo swallowed, his cheeks flushing red. "I had it under control," he mumbled, but Claude only snorted in reply. The day couldn't have ended soon enough, and now the weak glow of the moon illuminated the bare trees lining the way. Polo had been at the tavern longer than he intended, and the warmth of the hearth still clung faintly to him. He exhaled, his breath misting in the still night. He was no stranger to drunken walks home. Just then, a groan of faint anguish stopped him in his tracks. Squinting ahead, he spotted a dark shape crumpled by the roadside. "Hello?" Polo called, his voice echoing faintly. As he stepped closer, he saw the frail figure of an elderly man sprawled over a bundle of firewood, his hands trembling as he struggled to lift himself up. His breaths came shallow and laboured. "Zoons!" Polo muttered, rushing to his side. "What are you doing out here?" The man's face turned up towards him, pale and lined with deep creases, his eyes clouded with pain. "Needed wood. Stove's cold." His words were barely audible. "You'll freeze to death if you stay out here, Seneschal," Polo said. Crouching down, he heaved the man to his feet, his shoulders sagging under the weight of the firewood as he steadied the old man's frail frame. "Come on, let's get you home." His cottage wasn't far, a small, dilapidated structure with a sagging roof and a crooked chimney. Inside, the air was frigid, and the faint scent of mildew lingered. Polo set the firewood by the hearth and began arranging it while the man sank into a battered chair. "You're lucky I came by when I did," Polo said, lighting the kindling. Flames crackled to life, their warmth slowly filling the room. The old man gave a weak chuckle. "Aye, lucky." He gestured to a small table. "Sit. Least I can do is share a meal with you." Polo hesitated, but he pulled up a rickety stool. The man shuffled to the cupboard and returned with a loaf of stale bread and a block of cheese, setting them on the table with trembling hands. Over the modest meal, the man began to speak, his voice distant and wistful. He told Polo of his younger years, of the family he once had, and of the brother he'd lost. "He was a stubborn fool, my brother," the man said, staring into the flames. "Stubborn but kind. Always had a way of making you laugh, even when you didn't want to." "What happened to him?" Polo asked softly. The man's eyes glistened in the firelight. "Fell ill one winter. Nothing the healer could do. He was gone in days. We'd argued before it happened. Stupid things. Pride. Anger. The sort of things you think matter until it's too late." Polo shifted in his seat, the words striking uncomfortably close to home. The man sighed, his shoulders slumping. "If I could just speak to him one more time. Just to say, I'm sorry." He shook his head, a bitter smile tugging at his lips. "But that's the thing about time. It doesn't wait for you to set things right." Polo was silent, the man's regret heavy in the air between them. The man poured out 2 small cups of ale and slid one towards Polo. "Here's to brothers," he said with a sad smile. Polo stared at the drink, the smell of the beer stirring memories of the countless nights he'd drowned his own pain. His fingers hovered over the cup, but he couldn't bring himself to lift it. For the first time in years, he said, "No, not tonight." The early morning light spilled weakly through the frost-laced windows of the butcher's shop, and the hearth had already warmed the chilly air, as Claude descended the creaking stairs, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. The scent of the fresh fire and the faint clang of knives greeted him, an unusual hum of activity for such an hour. At the counter, Polo stood with his back turned, already wearing his apron and meticulously sharpening a blade. Claude stopped mid-step, quite startled. "You're up early?" Claude said gruffly, trying to mask his surprise. Polo glanced over his shoulder, offering a quick nod before returning to his task. "Figured I'd get a head start. Big order to fill and all." Claude narrowed his eyes but said nothing, instead moving towards his station. And the two worked. The rhythmic sounds of chopping, slicing, and packaging filled the shop, breaking the silence between them. Well, the manor order was no small task. Over the next 4 days, the brothers threw themselves into their work. Polo rose earlier than Claude each morning, already preparing the shop by the time his brother came downstairs. He worked with a focus and an energy Claude hadn't seen in years, packing cuts of meat, organising deliveries, and even handling customers with an ease that took some of the load off Claude's shoulders. For once, the shop wasn't a source of tension, but a hive of bustling cheer. Customers came and went, the counters piled high with festive orders, game, hens, roasts, strings of sausages, while the air buzzed with the scents of spices and smoked meats. Helicina stopped by daily to pick up supplies for the tavern, her usual sharpness softened into something warm and cheerful. "Well," she said, resting her hands on her hips, "this is where you've been hiding, Polo." Polo grinned, wiping his hands on his apron. "Not hiding, working." Even Claude had to admit the change was remarkable. The shop seemed brighter, more inviting. A festive banner crafted by Marcule hung proudly over the counter, its deep reds and greens lending a touch of Yuletide cheer. The tailor had delivered it himself, a rare smile crossing his face as he admired the brothers' industrious work. By the time they completed the manor order, the shop was practically gleaming. Polo was the last to stop, even after Claude had already called it a night, tidying the counters and checking the inventory one last time. On the final morning, as they loaded the carefully prepared meats onto the cart bound for the manor, Claude paused. Leaning on the counter, he glanced at Polo, who was adjusting the straps on the delivery. "You've done good," Claude said awkwardly, his voice quieter than usual. Polo looked up, caught off guard by the rare praise. He gave a small sheepish smile. "Thanks. Just wanted to make sure we got it done right." Claude nodded, the words hanging between them like a bridge, finally beginning to form. For the first time in years, the shop felt like theirs again. Not just a place of work, but a symbol of what they could achieve together. The brothers arrived at the manor courtyard with the final delivery just as the bells of the village church tolled noon. Their cart, laden with carefully packed meats wrapped in twine and linen, creaked under the weight. A brisk wind swept through the courtyard as they unloaded the last pieces together. "Well, that's the last of it," said Polo, handing over a large bundle of sausages to one of the manor stewards. He wiped his brow, a mixture of exhaustion and satisfaction settling on his face. Claude surveyed the remaining crates, almost in disbelief. He let out a low whistle. "Can't believe we actually managed to pull this off. Thought for sure we'd be scrambling until you'll feast." Polo chuckled, straightening up. "Guess I'm full of surprises, eh?" Claude didn't answer, but the faintest trace of a smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. The steward thanked them both and hurried back into the manor, leaving the two brothers standing in the quiet courtyard. As they secured the now empty cart, Polo reached into his apron and pulled out a small, neatly wrapped parcel of meat. It was tied with a simple string, the linen clean and crisp. Listen," Polo said, his tone uncharacteristically serious. "I've got a quick errand to run. Meet me back at the shop. There's something I want to give you." Claude's eyebrow raised. curiosity flickering in his expression, but he simply nodded. "Don't keep me waiting too long," he muttered, as Polo strode off towards the village square. Back at the butcher shop, Claude leaned in his usual spot at the counter, the warmth of the shop's hearth chasing away the cold that had seeped into his bones. He started tidying the workspace when the door creaked open and Polo stepped inside, his cheeks red from the cold and his hands hidden behind his back. "Finally," Claude grumbled, though there was no real annoyance in his tone. Polo approached the counter, slightly shy. "All right," he said, producing a long, carefully wrapped bundle and placing it on the counter. This is for you." Claude hesitated before unwrapping the gift. His fingers worked at the string, and as the cloth fell away, he froze. In his hands was a finely crafted butcher's knife, its blade gleaming even in the dim light. The handle was sturdy and thick, a tool meant to last a lifetime. "Polo." Claude's voice trailed off as he stared at the knife. "You've been using that old blade for years, brother," Polo said, scratching the back of his neck. "Figured it was time for something new, and, well, I just wanted to say thanks for not giving up on the shop. Or on me." For a moment, Claude said nothing. Then, with a deep breath, he stepped around the counter and pulled Polo into a rough, wordless embrace. The gesture was stiff at first, awkward, unfamiliar, but it softened into something more genuine. "Thank you," Claude muttered. Polo clapped his brother on the back. "Don't get all sentimental on me now." They stood there for a moment, the weight of years of tension and regret seeming to lift. The fire crackled warmly in the hearth. The Yule banner above swayed gently. For the first time in years, the shop didn't feel like just a place of work. It felt like home. As usual, if you have been, thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. I wish you a very Merry Christmas. This has been Foundation, and I have been Lord Bara.